Alita's bare feet bled on the iron frontier stones. Mika, just 5 winters old, had stopped crying in her arms, and a silent orc child terrifies his mother more than any blade. She spotted a lone cabin in Thornwood. One last chance. The River Tescan had no mercy. Alita walked its muddy bank with Mika pressed against her chest and Kai clinging to her belt. The boy's small green fingers were pale at the tips, a sign she knew too well. When an orc child's colour faded from the hands first, the cold was already inside the bone. 4 months had passed since the mercenaries came. They rode in from Goldport with iron badges and borrowed authority, and they cut down Drac before the sun had fully risen. He had been standing in the doorway of their tent, half awake when the first shot hit him. Alita had grabbed the children and run into the dark forest without boots, without food, without direction. The tribe dispersed after the fever came. It moved through the camp like smoke, quiet, invisible, and total. Elders went first, then the young warriors. By the 3rd week, there was no one left to make decisions together. Alita packed what she could carry on her back and followed the river south. The Tescan was low now. Summer drought had pulled the water far from its usual banks, leaving cracked clay and the smell of rot. The roots she had taught Kai to recognize were gone, dried to thin brown threads in the ground. A lizard scrambled under a rock as they passed. She considered catching it and decided to keep walking. Millbrook had been the worst. She had approached its outer gate with Mika unconscious and burning, and the gatekeeper had looked at her ears, the sharp, upswept points that marked every orc, and shaken his head without a word. The door had closed. She had heard laughter on the other side, now Thornwood. She had smelled it before she saw it, sawdust, pine resin, wood smoke. The scent was almost warm. It moved through the cold air like a promise she was afraid to trust, because every promise in the last 4 months had been a door closing. She crested a small rise in the land and stopped. The cabin stood alone in a clearing where the forest thinned. It was small but solid. Oak walls fitted tight, a stone chimney pushing smoke in a steady grey line into the pale sky. There was a wood pile twice as tall as the cabin itself, stacked against the east wall. A fence of split timber ran around a yard that held a goat pen, a cold forge, and a workbench covered in chisels and curls of pale wood. A man stood at the bench. He was broad and slow-moving, like a door that had been hung too heavy for its frame. He struck a chisel against a log with mechanical repetition, not carving anything, just hitting. His hair was grey-brown. His coat was old. Alita did not move for a long moment. Mika shifted against her chest and made a sound. Not a cry, just a small exhale, the kind that meant he was still there. She looked down at his face. His lashes were dark against his pale cheeks. His lips were the wrong colour. She had carried her pride across every mile of this broken road. It had been the last thing Drac ever asked of her. Never kneel to a stranger, never show them the soft underside of your throat. But Drac was not here, and Mika's hands were pale at the tips. She began walking down toward the cabin. The man at the workbench did not look up. The chisel struck again. Above the forge, a single crow sat on the fence post and watched her come, its head tilted as though it had been waiting. Something about that bird made her slow her step. It was too still. Its black eye caught the light at an angle that seemed wrong. Not the flat shine of a normal eye, but something deeper, like looking down into water and seeing the bottom too clearly. Among her people, a crow that watched without fear was called a guide spirit, a presence that appeared at crossroads to mark the path already chosen, not the path still open. She did not know if she believed that anymore, but she felt in that moment that something had just been witnessed. It watched her. Then it was gone. She filed the moment away behind her ribs and kept walking. Edmund heard the footsteps before he looked up. Most sounds in Thornwood he knew by heart. The way the goat shifted in the pen, the creak of the fence when wind came from the north, the distant crack of ice on the upper Tescan in winter. These footsteps were different. Too light for a man, too deliberate for an animal, too slow for someone with anything left to run from. He turned. The woman at the edge of his yard was orc. He registered that fact the way he registered most things. Quietly, without drama, like noting the cloud cover. She was tall, even bent as she was under the weight on her back. Her skin was a deep olive green, the color of moss on north-facing stone. Her ears rose to sharp points through tangled dark hair. Her lower lip carried the faint curve of small tusks, not aggressive, just present, the way bone structure is present. She was carrying a child. Another one, smaller, older, gripped the back of her coat. Edmund set the chisel down. He had been in the Iron Frontier long enough to have seen orcs in every context the world offered, trading in the outer markets, riding at full speed along the canyon roads, working cattle on the borderlands with a skill that made human ranchers quietly jealous. He had fought beside one in the Northern Marches campaign, a broad-shouldered man named Korth who had pulled Edmund out of a collapsed trench and never mentioned it again. He had never seen one look like this. She stopped a few feet from the fence. She did not speak immediately. She looked at him with green eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that had already decided they were not going to beg. They were just going to state. Then the child in her arms made a sound, a tiny sound, barely a breath. Her composure cracked, not completely, not a collapse, just a crack, the kind that runs through good timber and does not mean it will break, but means it is already under more weight than it was built for. She said in flat, careful human tongue, "I am not here for myself." Edmund waited. "My children have not eaten in 3 days. The boy is sick." She shifted Mika in her arms, just slightly, just enough for Edmund to see his face, pale for an orc, wrong color at the lips. "I do not ask for anything for me. Feed them. Whatever you want from me in return, I will give. Work, labor, anything that is mine to give." She paused. The older child, a girl, Edmund now saw, maybe 8 years old, green-faced and hollow-eyed, pressed closer to her mother's coat. "I can endure hunger," Alita said. "They cannot." Edmund looked at the boy's face for a moment. Then he looked at the yard, the woodpile, the cabin behind him, the cold forge, the single room with the table for one. He picked up his chisel from the workbench, not to use, just to hold. An old habit when he was thinking. He had been alone in this cabin for 3 years. Before that, a war. Before the war, a wife who had left. The sequence had pressed something flat in him that he had grown accustomed to carrying around like a coin, with no value. Something you keep in your pocket, not because it's worth anything, but because you've had it so long you don't notice the weight anymore. He put the chisel down again. "The bread is hard," he said. "The soup is thin." He opened the gate. "But it's theirs. Come in." The inside of the cabin smelled like wood smoke and old wool, and something faintly bitter that Alita recognized as medicinal root, the kind men sometimes boiled to ease joint pain after cold seasons. It was a single room, a stone fireplace, banked low, a table of rough pine, 2 chairs and a stool, a cot against one wall with a blanket the color of old mud. Tools hung in rows along the east wall with a precision that said more about the man than anything he'd spoken so far. Edmund moved to the fire first, feeding it 2 split logs without ceremony. Then he crossed to the shelf above the hearth and lifted down a clay pot and a small wheel of bread wrapped in cloth. Alita set Mika on the cot. He was not unconscious. His eyes opened slightly when she laid him down, and he turned his head toward the fire's heat with the instinct of the very young and very cold. She pulled the blanket over him and kept one hand pressed to his forehead. The fever was still there, not climbing, but holding. Kai stood near the door, watching Edmund. She had not moved since they came in. Her eyes tracked him the way a child tracks something that is not yet decided, not prey, not predator, but unknown. Edmund set the pot on the fire hook and ladled water from a barrel into it. He cut the bread into thick, uneven pieces on the table. Then he crossed to the goat pen door at the back of the cabin, went out briefly, and came back with a small jug. "Goat milk," he said, putting it on the table. "Warm it if you want. The pot's free once the water boils." He didn't look at her when he said it. He went to his workbench in the corner and sat down and picked up a piece of wood and a small knife. Alita watched him for a moment. She had expected conditions by now. Humans always had conditions, not always spoken, but present, waiting behind the generosity, like a shadow waiting behind a lamp. She had prepared answers, she had prepared postures, she had prepared the particular stillness that cost her nothing to give while protecting everything that mattered. Edmund carved. The knife moved in small, careful strokes. He wasn't looking at the wood exactly. His gaze was slightly unfocused, the look of a man whose hands know what to do without instruction. Kai moved to the table. She looked at the bread. She looked at her mother. "Go ahead," Alita said. The girl ate the way children eat when they've been hungry long enough to lose the pretense of manners, both hands, eyes down, completely absorbed. Alita brought the warm milk to Mika and lifted his head and helped him drink in small, careful sips. He swallowed. The color in his hands shifted very slightly towards something living. Edmund glanced over once, just once, then went back to the wood. Alita sat on the stool near the fire and did not eat. She was aware of her own hunger, the way you are aware of an old injury. It was there. It was real. But she had been managing it for long enough that it had become part of the background noise of the day. What she was aware of more sharply was the fire and the warmth coming through the stone floor, and the specific quality of silence in this cabin. Not empty silence, but the silence of a place that had once held more people than it did now. She looked at the tools on the wall. Each one hung exactly in place, each one clean. "You live alone," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Edmund said. "For long?" A pause. The knife moved. "Long enough." She nodded and said nothing more. Outside, through the single small window, the afternoon light was going grey. The crow came back to the fence post. She could see it from here. It sat with that same stillness, that same quality of waiting. Its eye caught the fire's light from across the yard and held it like a coal. She understood now what it was, and she let it watch without fear, the way you let a known thing be what it is. Then the wind shifted, and it was gone again, and Alita decided she was tired enough to trust that the morning would explain whatever the evening would not. Edmund did not sleep well. He lay on the floor. He had given the cot to Alita and the children without thinking, because they needed it, and the floor was simply the floor, and watched the fire burn down, and listened to the cabin breathe. The boy's fever had not broken yet. Alita had been up twice in the night, lifting his head, pressing a wet cloth to his neck. She moved without sound. That was something he had not expected. He had expected on some formless level disruption, noise, the friction of strangers in a tight space. Instead, the cabin felt, in the hours before dawn, almost settled, like a room after long furniture has finally been moved back into place. He did not know what to do with that feeling, so he set it aside. By morning the soup was on, thin but hot, dried field turnips, and the last of a smoked bone he had been stretching for a week. Edmund brought water from the well. He found Alita already awake, sitting on the floor beside the cot, her knees drawn up and her head resting on her arms. She was asleep in that position, her body curved toward the children like a wall. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Mika. The boy's lips had color again. Not full color, not healthy color, but not the grey-white of the night before. His breathing was even. Edmund went to the fire and stirred the pot. Around mid-morning, Mika opened his eyes properly. He looked at the ceiling, then at his mother, then at Edmund. He stared at Edmund, the way small children stare at things that don't fit any category they have yet. Without fear, without judgment, with pure, unfiltered assessment. "You're big," Mika said. Edmund looked at him. "Yes, your hair is the color of old snow. Yes. Mika appeared to find this satisfactory and closed his eyes again. Kai, who had been watching from the corner since she woke, let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. Alita, who had come fully awake at Mika's voice, looked at her son and then briefly closed her eyes in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. That afternoon, Edmund was out splitting wood when he heard the sound of the forge bellows from inside the cabin. He walked to the window and looked in. Alita was at the cold forge, working the bellows with long, smooth strokes. She had found the iron rod he used for heating tools and was studying its temper with a critical eye, the way someone studies a thing they know well and are deciding whether it was made right. He went back to his wood. An hour later she came outside. She had found his spare leather apron somewhere and put it on over her pelt coat. It was too short and too wide on her frame, but it was on correctly, tied at the right places, functional. "The forge flue is partially blocked," she said. "Soot build-up. If you have an iron brush, I can clear it." He pointed to the toolbox. She found the brush, went inside, and cleared it. He heard the difference in the drawer immediately. The fires pulled stronger and even. He did not say anything, neither did she, but something shifted in the structure of the day, small and functional and real, like a joint correctly fitted after years of forcing. That evening, while the children slept, they sat on opposite sides of the table. Edmund drank his tea. Alita worked a cracked leather strap from Mika's pack, using a bone needle and sinew thread. The fire moved in the hearth. "You didn't eat yesterday," Edmund said. "I ate. I watched the food. You didn't." She kept her eyes on the leather. "I ate enough." He did not argue, but in the morning he put a bowl on the table with a full portion and went outside before she came down, and when he came back, the bowl was empty. He considered that a beginning. The agreement was never spoken as a formal thing. It grew instead from the shape of the days, from Alita finding the weak stone in the east chimney wall and pointing it out, from Edmund rebuilding it while she held the stones in place, from Kai learning where the tool hooks were and beginning to hang them back in order after each use. By the fourth day, a routine had formed. Edmund cut and sold timber to the mills downstream. Slow, steady work that paid in copper mostly, sometimes in kind. Alita had taken over the herb garden that had gone wild and unattended behind the cabin, pulling it back into rows with quiet patience. She knew plants Edmund didn't have names for. She planted seeds from a small pouch at her hip that she'd carried the entire journey. "Orc healing root?" Edmund asked, watching her. "Some. Also good for soup." She pressed soil over a row. "The ones with red stems, not the ones with grey." Mika was out of the cot. He sat in the yard in a patch of pale sunlight, pulling grass into small piles with the intense focus of a child who has found a project. Kai had started bringing water from the well without being asked. It felt, from a distance, like a household. From a distance. The first sign of trouble came from the river road. Edmund heard it while he was loading cut timber onto the sledge. 2 riders from Millbrook crossing the outer pasture, pulling up short when they saw Alita carrying stones to the fence repair. They did not approach. They looked for a long moment. Then they turned back toward the road. Edmund watched them go. "They'll talk," he said. "I know," Alita said. She set the stone in place. "They've been talking since we arrived." He tested the fence post. Solid. He moved to the next one. "Does it worry you?" he asked. She considered the question with the honest attention she gave most things. "Not yet. It worries me when the talking becomes walking." He understood that. He had seen it in the war, how long it took for tension to convert into action, how that conversion, when it finally came, was rarely gradual. That evening, while Kai slept and Mika dozed near the fire, Alita sat at the table and unrolled something from her coat. A flat piece of treated hide, painted with small careful marks in faded ochre and black. She spread it flat and studied it. Edmund came to look. He didn't ask. "My clan's route map," she said, "before the fever. These were our winter camps." She pointed to marks along what he recognized as the upper canyon system north of Thornwood. This one was ours for 8 seasons. The humans named it Dead Crow Canyon. We called it something else. What did you call it? She said a word in orc tongue. It was guttural and deep and had a rhythm to it he couldn't replicate. What does it mean? She smoothed the edge of the hide. The place where we always came back. He looked at the map for a moment, then at her hands, the knuckles scarred, the palms worn in the same places his were, from the same kind of repeated grip on the same kind of tools. You'll go back, he said. Not a question, not a request for her to stay, just a statement of what seemed true. Someday, she said, when there is something to go back to. The fire moved. Outside, the wind came off the highlands cold and even, pushing through the pine tops with a sound like distant water. On the fence post, nothing sat, but Edmund thought, not for the first time, that the post looked recently occupied. The trouble from Millbrook arrived in the form of commerce first. Edmund went to the grain merchant on the 7th day of their arrangement and was told the price of his standard order had doubled. Supply shortage, the merchant said without meeting his eyes. Edmund bought half and walked back to the sledge with the bag over his shoulder, working through the math of the week. 2 days later, the ironmonger refused to sell him nails outright, offered instead to hold an account that required a silver deposit Edmund didn't have. He said nothing to Alita about either transaction, but she knew. She knew from the way the supply bags were lighter. She knew from how long he stood at the workbench doing calculations with a stick in the sawdust. She knew from the specific quality of his silence, the kind that is working, not resting. On the 11th day she came and stood across the workbench. "Tell me what it costs," she said. He looked up. "The grain, the iron, whatever they're charging you now that I'm here." She kept her voice level. "I need to know, so I can plan," he told her. She listened without expression. Then she said, "I have this." She placed a small bundle on the workbench, wrapped in oiled cloth. He opened it. 3 crystals, deep blue, each about the size of a thumb joint. Sky crystal from the high canyons. Humans in the border towns trade well for them. I've been carrying them since before the fever. Edmund looked at the crystals. They were beautiful in the way that meant genuinely valuable, not decorative, but with the particular clarity of something rare. "That's more than what they're squeezing us for," he said. "I know." He rewrapped the cloth carefully. "I don't want your crystals. They aren't a gift. They're an investment." She looked at him directly. "We are operating as a household under pressure. Investments are part of that." He sat down on his stool. He thought about the word household. He had not used it for himself in 3 years. It had seemed in that time like a word that applied to other people, people with more warmth in them, or more certainty, or more of whatever quality made a space become a place where people were kept instead of just sheltered. "Half," he said finally. "Half what?" "Half of whatever those bring. That's what we put toward expenses. The other half stays yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "Agreed," she said. They did not shake hands. Orcs, he had learned, sealed agreements differently. A single flat palm pressed to the surface between them, brief and direct. She pressed her palm to the workbench. He looked at it, then pressed his own beside it. The wood between their hands was rough and marked from years of use. It held. Several weeks passed in the rhythm of work and cold and the slow accumulation of small trust. Then winter came early to the northern edge of Thornwood. The first snow fell on a night when the wind dropped completely, that particular silence that old country people recognized as a warning. By morning, 6 inches covered the yard, and the cold had a different quality to it, less like weather and more like intent. Edmund woke with pain in his chest. He knew the feeling, had known it for years. The fever of iron, the border doctors called it. A lung sickness that cycled back in cold seasons. particularly in men who had spent winters in the wet trenches of the Northern Marches campaign. He had managed it before. He had managed it alone, mostly, lying by the fire for a week, letting it pass. He got up. He fed the goat. He split 4 logs and came back inside and sat down heavily in his chair and did not get up again. By midday the fever was undeniable. He did not tell Alita. She told him, came to stand in front of him, pressed the back of her hand to his forehead with the direct practicality of someone used to assessing illness in children and adults both. "You're burning," she said. "It passes. It passes better with help." She was already at the shelf, reading his small collection of dried herbs with expert attention, sorting quickly, decisively, setting aside most of it as inadequate. "I need forest material. What grows north of the property line?" "Everything. I don't—" "Fever leaf? Grey stone moss? The root they call iron blood in the canyon markets? I've seen grey stone moss near the upper creek." She was at the door. "Alita." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "The snow's deep now. The creek is— I have been in worse snow than this." She looked back at him, and he saw in her face a steadiness that was not casual. "Stay by the fire. I will be back before dark." She left Kai in charge of the fire and Mika's warmth and walked into the white forest alone. She was back in 2 hours. She had grey stone moss, fever leaf, and something else. A dark bark he didn't recognize, stripped carefully from a tree only orcs seemed to know. She boiled them together in the clay pot with precise timing, testing the smell at intervals, adjusting. She fed it to him in small doses. It was intensely bitter. He drank it without complaint. By evening his temperature had dropped, not gone, but manageable. He woke in the deep night to find Alita asleep in the chair beside him, a damp cloth folded in her lap, her head fallen to one side. The fire was still burning. She had fed it while he slept. Edmund lay still for a long time. He looked at the tools on the wall, the breadcloth on the table, the small sleeping forms of the children on the cot, the woman asleep in the chair. He thought, this is what I had before the war, before the leaving, this exact arrangement of warmth and proximity and the specific quality of not being alone. He had stopped believing it could exist again so completely that he had stopped counting its absence. He closed his eyes. The crow came in the dream, black, still, watching from a high branch. It opened its mouth and said nothing. Then it was gone, and Edmund stood in an empty clearing, and the snow fell, and he was not cold. When the fever finally broke, fully, cleanly on the 4th day, Edmund found Alita at the workbench with his spare chisel, cutting dovetail joints into a piece of oak with precision he hadn't expected. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She cut the last angle and held the joint up to the window light. Clean. Tight. She set it down and looked at him. "You're standing properly," she said. "You cut a dovetail joint. My father was a woodworker before the clan wars." She set the chisel down in its proper place. I watched him long enough. He came and sat at the table. She brought him tea without asking. The normal morning tea, not the medicinal kind. That distinction felt significant. "I owe you," he said. She sat across from him. "You owe me nothing. You housed us. You fed my children. The nursing is simple accounting. Simple accounting. Yes." He looked at the tea. He turned the cup in his hands. The habit of several years of drinking it alone meant he always held the cup in both hands, as though it might be taken. He said, "My wife left 3 years ago." He had not intended to say it. It came out the way things come out after fever, without the usual door. Alita did not react immediately. She waited. She went to Goldport with a lord who had more silver and fewer bad dreams. He set the cup down. "I don't blame her specifically. I came back from the Marches campaign different. Most of us did. I was difficult to be near, I think." "You are not difficult to be near," Alita said. "Now." "Now," she agreed. Outside, Kai and Mika were in the yard. Mika was attempting to stack snow into a shape that had no clear ambition, just height, more height, the compulsive height-seeking of small children in first snow. Kai was pretending not to help while clearly helping. "Drac died in a doorway," Alita said. She said it the same way Edmund had said his thing, straightforward, past the door. He was still half asleep. They didn't give him the dignity of knowing it was coming. She paused. He deserved a warrior's death. He didn't get one. "No," Edmund said. "That's not fair." "No." They sat with that for a moment. Then Alita said quietly, "Orcs do not leave their allies in the snow, Edmund." He looked at her. "When we say someone is a person of our fire, of our camp, we don't leave them. Not for weather, not for sickness, not for pressure from outside." She held his gaze. "You are a person of this fire now. You should know that." Edmund picked up his tea. He thought about the word fire, how orcs used it for something humans called home. But that meant more than building and roof and property line. Fire meant something chosen, something tended, something you returned to. "I know," he said. He meant it. Captain Warren rode into the yard on a grey morning 10 days later, with 4 men behind him and the particular posture of someone who has decided the day's outcome before it began. Edmund was at the woodpile. Alita was in the herb garden, her back to the road. She heard the horses and stood and turned, and the look on her face changed, not to fear, but to recognition. She had seen men like Warren before. Warren was Millbrook's frontier officer, theoretically a keeper of peace, practically a contractor for whoever currently held Goldport's purse. He wore the iron badge of border authority on his chest, and carried it like it was heavier than it was. "Marcenero," he called, using the old country word for the trade he'd looked up. "We've had reports." Edmund set down his axe. "Reports of what?" "Orc woman, 2 children, unauthorized settlement inside the frontier zone." Warren looked at Alita. "There are outstanding warrants for members of the Tescan clan. Insurgents, according to Goldport's record." "She's not insurgent," Edmund said. "She's a mother with 2 children who nearly died on that road. That's not Millbrook's classification. Then Millbrook's classification is wrong." Warren's posture shifted slightly. One of the men behind him moved a hand to his rifle. Edmund picked up his axe, not raised, just held. "I've known wrong authority before, Captain. Wore a uniform beside it for 4 years. It doesn't change what's wrong." Alita came from the garden and stood level with Edmund. She did not carry a weapon. She did not need to appear to. "I am Alita, daughter of Grack of the Jade Claw," she said. Her voice was steady and clear. "I am not a member of any insurgent clan. My clan is gone. My family is here. This man gave us shelter when your town closed its gates to a sick child. The law did not feed my son," she said. "This man did." Warren looked at them both for a long moment. He looked at the cabin, the repaired chimney, the straight fence, the tool order visible through the window, the established, functional fact of the place. He looked at Edmund's axe. He looked at the 4 men behind him, who were beginning to recalculate their certainty. "There will be a formal record," Warren said at last, "that this situation was reviewed." "Record whatever you need," Edmund said. Warren turned his horse. The 4 men followed. They rode back to the road and were absorbed by the tree line. Edmund set the axe against the woodpile. Alita exhaled once, controlled, complete. She looked at the road where they'd gone. "They'll come back," she said. "Maybe. Or they'll find someone easier to push." "You're not easy to push." "No," he said. "Not anymore." Kai came to the doorway of the cabin, one hand on the frame, watching the empty road. Mika pressed under her arm, looking out with wide eyes. "Are they gone?" Mika asked. "They're gone," Alita said. "Will they come back?" Edmund looked at the boy, his restored colour, his curious face, the small hands gripping the doorframe. "If they do," Edmund said, "they'll find the same thing they found today, Mika seemed to think this was satisfactory. He disappeared back inside. Kai followed, glancing once at her mother before she went. The yard was quiet. The cold air moved through it clean and even. Alita stood beside Edmund at the woodpile, and they looked at the road together without speaking. The crow did not come that morning. Edmund noticed its absence the way you notice a sound that has stopped. Relief, but also the particular attentiveness that follows relief. He looked at the fence post where it always sat. Nothing. The guide spirit had marked the crossroads and moved on, as his kind always did. The path chosen was no longer open. It had already become the path lived. He picked up the axe and set a log on the block. The split crack echoed through the clearing, and the smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight and steady in the still air. And somewhere inside, Mika was stacking something. Blocks, probably, always height, always more height, and the sound of it carried through the window like the simple evidence of a life continuing. Edmund stacked the split wood against the east wall, log by log, in the growing pile that was also a kind of record, of days past, of warmth stored, of a winter being prepared for by more than one person. Alita went back to the garden. The red-stemmed plants were showing through the snow at the bed's edge, small and certain, the way things grow when they have been properly tended. She pressed her palm to the soil once, the same gesture she had used at the workbench the day of the agreement, brief and direct and real. Then she began to work.